All right, so let's get started immediately and try to figure out what is going on under the hood of Angular forms, right? And there are some questions we trying to find answers to in the following 30 minutes or so. And the first question is like what happens when we import the form module. And today I will be talking about template-driven forms, but once you get the idea, you will be able to understand what is going on also under the hood of reactive forms, because they have a lot of in common actually. So this is the first question what we will cover, what is going on when we import the forms module. And the second question is how control statuses are being resolved. By the control statuses, I mean, this valid, invalid status, or if the form control is touched or untouched, dirty, and etc., etc. And the third question is how the data is being synchronized between the model, means the instance of the form control class, and their corresponding native controls like text input, select, radio button, etc. Let's have a look at this short video. Currently, you can see that there is a simple HTML5 form that has no Angular form features applied. It's just a pure HTML5 form. And when I click the submit button, the page is reloaded, which is actually the default behavior of the HTML5 form. But what will happen when we import the forms module into the corresponding feature module or component? Well, in this case, if you try to submit the button, the form, you can see that the behavior has changed and the page is not being related anymore. So what kind of magic happened once we imported this forms module? And this is the very first question we will try to figure out. And for that, let's try to investigate a little bit the form tag element. And we will do it by using special utility functions that belong to the global ng object that is available if you run the Angular application in development mode. And we can see that there are already 3 directives resides. So you can see the ng no validate, ng control status group, and ng form directives. But how they were applied, right? Because if we have a look at the form template, you can see that we didn't do that explicitly in our component template. So yeah, well, what's going on at all? And this is the thing that especially beginners in Angular forget about, or some of the beginners even don't know that fact that the selector for the directive is not necessarily should be an attribute of some element. Yeah, it might be, actually, it might be some CSS class, or it can be some tag name. And this is exactly the case in our scenario, because if we have a look at the source code of those 3 directives we saw 1 minute ago, you will see that those are just regular Angular directives. They have just an appropriate selector that makes a form tag element as a valid selector for them. So let's currently have a look at all those 3 directives and learn their responsibilities. So the first one is the ng form directive. This directive creates a form group instance that represents the entire form, and it adds or removes form controls and child form groups from this root form group. Additionally, it also handles events like submit and form reset. And this is, by the way, the reason why on submit event, when we submit the form, the page stopped to be reloaded, because inside the onSubmit handler, Angular prevents the default behavior, and it does it by returning just false from this handler function, and it prevents the page reloading. But I will not be stopping on the implementation details, right? Because we don't have so much time for that. That's why let's move forward, and let's have a look at the next directive called ng no validate. And this directive is a very simple one. It is just adds a no validate attribute to the element where this directive is attached. And in such a way, it disables the native validation of the browser, because once we use Angular forms, we suppose that Angular forms will care about validation and other stuff, right? And this is, you can see currently, this is the whole source code of this directive. It is extremely straightforward. And the third one, it is ng control status group directive. And this directive is responsible for tracking statuses of the form, like if the form was touched, if the form is valid, invalid, and etc., etc. And as you can see, all those three directives, they have a common selector that makes the form element a valid selector. Also, you can notice that not pseudo selectors being used, which actually excludes the form element that has this attribute, which means that if for whatever reason you want to make some form indivisible for Angular, you want that Angular ignores some certain form, you just add this ng no form attribute to the form element, and these form directives will not be applied to the form with this attribute. So I hope it is clear. So now we know. Yeah, so some quick recap. Now we know that the form element is not alone, and it actually has some friends, yeah, namely three directives that were magically applied once we imported the forms module. So since we know how it is done, yeah, the magic isn't a magic anymore. So yeah, but what about the ng model directive? What happens when we apply ng model to some native control like input and implement those all two-way data binding stuff, like you can see on the screenshot? So for that, let's investigate one more time the input that has ng model applied. Likewise, we did with the form element. So I'm going to use again this get directives utility function. And yeah, you can see that there are three directives, again, reside on this element: the default value accessor, ng control, what's going on? Yeah, ng control status, and ng model itself. So kind of similar story like with form element, right? But slightly different directives. And yeah, now let's have a look at all those three directives and learn what their responsibilities is. And yeah, so the first one, it's ng model itself. It is very familiar to you all, I think, and it is very familiar to you all directive, and basically this directive is responsible for the following thing. It creates a form control instance, as you can see on the line, on the very last line on the screenshot, and it adds or remove this form control instance to the parent form group. And also, in addition, it implements obviously two-way data binding. So basically happens those main two things. Actually does probably a bit more stuff, but yeah, we focus only on the things that matters at this time. So then we have the next directive called ng control status directive, and it is responsible for applying corresponding CSS classes like ng valid, ng dirty, and etc. It is very similar to what you have seen on the previous slide with the previous directive, but before it was the ng control group status that was tracking the group of controls. Yeah, and this directive tracks the statuses for for some certain control. And the last one is the default value accessor directive, and this directive, it is a directive which implements the control value accessor interface and knows how to update the value of the control, or how to enable or disable the native control, for instance, some text input. And again, all of them, they have ng model attribute selector, as well as the last directive. It has just two long, selectors, so it was cut. But trust me, this ng model attribute selector is there. So yeah, this is the reason why all those three directives were applied to the node where the ng model directive resides. And yeah, about default value accessor, we will talk a little bit later. But for now, let's learn how those directives are, let's say, working with each other. Yeah, what their relationships and so on. So when we initialize a component that contains the form that is managed by Angular, we have the following flow. The ng form directive instance is being created, right? And then immediately at constructor time, this directive creates an instance of form group class that you most probably know from reactive forms. When you work with reactive forms, you do it in your class component by hands, but when you use template-driven forms, this form group is created by the dedicated directive, like ng form. Then, basically, at that time, the ng model directive is being instantiated, and immediately via dependency injection, the ng model directive injects the parent group, and in our case, it will be the instance of ng form. And again, at that time, it is still the constructor time. It creates also the instance of the form control class. And after that, lifecycle hooks are executed, right? And the first lifecycle hook that goes after the constructor, it is ng on changes, right? And exactly there, ng model calls the parent form, the method from parent form, which is called add control, and it provides itself means the instance of the ng model directive, it provides itself as an argument for that method. And already inside this method happens a bit more interesting stuff, because there happens the registration of form control in the container, where the container is basically our form group created by the ng form, right? And the registration happens by using the ng model directive name as a key value, and the control instance that is created by ng model, it becomes the value for this key. Yeah, so that's why it is necessary to provide the name property for the ng model if you use the ng model within the form tag, because the name is being used as a key inside the form group. And then after successful registration of the form control, we have to set up the registered control by calling the setup control function right here, which does, from my point of view, one of the most interesting things. This is basically the place where the model, means form control class instance, meets the value accessor. And this is the place where they are kind of linking together, and in such a way happens the state synchronization between the model and the native form control, and we will see it in a minute. So how does it happen? Now let's get back to this simple schema. And the thing is that besides injecting the parent form, ng model also injects value accessor, also via dependency injection. And in our case, it is represented as an instance of the default value accessor directive, because my ng model is attached to the text input, and how to work with text input knows exactly this built-in default value accessor directive. Yeah, there are a lot of different variations of value accessors. I would say it is actually infinite number, because besides the native controls like input, select, and radio buttons that have actually separate value accessors implemented specifically for those native elements. But the thing is that the form control can be basically any component. So for some specific component, you have to implement some specific value accessor. So that's why you can have myriad of variations of control value accessor. But what is the role of value accessor? Well, it knows how to work with some concrete native element. It works by using a set of methods that must be implemented in order to make it work, and in order to make it properly work and synchronize states. Yeah, there are 3 required methods and 1 optional, like set disable state. So for instance, if the model value changes, when value changes on the model side, then the right value method of the control value accessor is called, and inside the right value method should happen the logic that knows how to update the DOM element in order to reflect that new value from the form model instance should be reflected on the view side. Yeah, so if there are changes, it has to be synchronized with the view. And this is what does this right value method. But besides that, value accessor knows how to synchronize other states like disabled or enabled state, or value synchronization that happens other way around, from the view to the model, because the user can type a new value into the input, changing the actual value on the view side. So this new value has to be also synchronized with the corresponding form model. Yeah, so this should be synchronized in both directions. So this is like, if to explain the value accessor in short, actually it's very big topic and needs a bit more time to explain all those stuff. But yeah, the main thing what I wanted to highlight here on this slide is that ng model injects via dependency injection the value accessor and stores it in some corresponding class property like value accessor. So when we call this setup control function, basically we provide the form control instance and the value accessor. That is part of the directive instance. Yeah, so they both are available inside this function. Then inside the setup control function happens actually linking of those two together. So first of all, there happens synchronization of the model value with the view, and you can see that the right value method of value accessor is called, and they're provided the value from the form control model. And as you already know, the right value knows how to update the value, how to update the view with this new value. So you can see it happens just by updating the property value to the new value for this native element. A similar story happens also for disabled state synchronization. So immediately Angular checks if the control model is disabled. Then the setDisabled state method is called for the value accessor, and here again the value accessor knows how to update this thing by updating a corresponding property of the HTML element. And then we have a set of functions that are kind of listeners, but they're not like native JavaScript listeners, like click listener or mouse enter listener. Those functions, they kind of register some callbacks that are being executed when the state of the form control changes at some point of time, because the value might change in the future. The form control might be touched by user, or the native control might be touched in the future, and this state should be reflected on the corresponding model. So those things should be synchronized at some point in time. And to get understanding of how it is happening, let's have a look at only one of these listeners. And namely, I would like to demonstrate the setup view change pipeline function, which is responsible for the value synchronization from the view to the model, so other way around. And because a user, this is because a user can type new value, it has to be reflected on the model. So the setup view change pipeline function does a pretty simple thing, actually. It calls the value accessor's method called register on change. And as an argument, it provides a callback function that actually uses such a thing in JavaScript calls closure, and it captures a corresponding control model instance in the body of this callback. And what does this callback function? It just updates the value of the control with the new value that comes as an argument for that function. And it also marks the control as a dirty, obviously, because we changed the value, and mark it also as changed. At this point in time, it is kind of pending. You can see it has prefix pending, all those three properties. But once you call the update control function, the pending values become the real values. So pretty simple, I think, I hope. And by the way, and then exactly this callback is provided inside the value accessor for the register on change function. And then you usually capture it into some class property and call this function when the value is supposed to be changed. For instance, when the input event is fired or change event is fired, stuff like that. Yeah, and if you have already tried to create a custom form control, you should definitely remember this code, because it is very common. Yeah, but now you know what exactly which exactly magic function it is and how it actually works. Because yeah, I remember that like a couple of years ago, I didn't wonder what this function was and what it does. I was like, just okay, I should call this function when I have to update the model. Okay, then let's just do stuff. Then what I wanted to say. Yeah, this is definitely needs to be.
No worries, man. Just like the Angular
Yeah.
form, you are never alone. Take your time. Say what you need to say. There you go.
So
If you want, you can start like 2 years ago. You can start it back from there. You know.
probably because I already forgot the whole my what I exactly wanted to say about that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
All right.
5 seconds and I will start.
No problem.
Because I remember like a couple of years ago, I didn't even wonder what this function does and what this function was. I was like, okay, I should just call this function when I have to update my model, and yeah, okay, let's just do this stuff. Let's call it, and I didn't care what is hidden inside, but now we know a little bit more, and I think it is cool. And you know, the rest of the listeners, they work very similar way. They also register some callback functions that needs to be called at some point in time when some certain state needs to be synchronized. Okay, but yeah, I hope it was pretty much clear. And now let's move forward to the last question. And here we will talk about how Angular resolves form control CSS classes for form control statuses, which you all know if you have ever worked with Angular forms, those CSS classes like ngValid, ngDirty, etc., etc. So for that, responsible one directive called ngControlStatus. And it is a pretty simple directive. It injects the ngControl, and ngControl can be here resolved in one of these three directives. So it can be either a form control name instance, ng model directive instance, or it can be the instance of the form control directive. So those three directives, they extend ngControl class, and depending on where resides this ngControl status directive, there will be resolved a corresponding ngControl. In my example, I use template-driven form. So inside the ngControl, there will be resolved the instance of the ng model directive, and the instance of the ng model directive, it owns the instance of the form control model instance. Yeah, this is important to remember. So what happens then? As you can see, ng control status directive extends the abstract control status class that has some set of getters like this is valid, is invalid, etc. And what it does there, it just reads the corresponding status from the ng control, or better to say, from the instance of the form control that is captured inside the control property of the ng model, right? And it just returns a value, some true or false, yeah. And then based on the value that is returned from those getters, this directive already adds or removes the corresponding CSS classes from the host element where this directive resides. And it happens like that. And this is the same, not like the result of this notation will be the same as if you used the host binding decorator. Yeah, it's just an alternative notation that is being used in the source code of this directive, but in fact it just adds or removes the corresponding class, depends on the value from the getter. And that's it. Yeah, I hope I could somehow explain what is going on under the hood. Now you have better understanding what the processes are happening there, and I hope I didn't make you even more confused than before.